CEO disguised as entry-level worker discovers company's hidden crisis. Every story of transformation begins with a moment of truth. For Mark Reynolds, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in September as he stared at the portrait of his father hanging in the CEO's office, his office now. The morning light caught the gold nameplate beneath the portrait, John Reynolds Sr., founder and CEO. Below it, in the same gleaming letters, the words that built an empire: safety first, everything else, second. 3 months had passed since his father's death, but Mark still couldn't bring himself to change anything in the office. The leather chair still held the indent of his father's frame. The desk calendar still showed his last appointments, and the family photos still traced the company's growth from a single factory to an industrial giant. Every morning, Mark would straighten the same photos, adjust the same chairs, and try to fill shoes that felt impossibly large. Today, though, something was different. The manila envelope on his desk had no return address, no official markings, just his name written in blocked letters. Mark remembered the day that portrait was taken, just 6 months before his father's unexpected heart attack. The photographer had arrived with a rack of tailored suits, but John Sr. had walked in wearing his old work jacket from his factory days, the one with the Reynolds Manufacturing logo nearly worn away. "This is who I am," he'd insisted. "This is who built this company." Even then, fighting cancer and running an empire, he never forgot his roots. Inside the envelope, Mark found dozens of anonymous employee complaints from Reynolds Manufacturing's largest facility. Stories of quotas impossible to meet without breaking safety protocols. Reports of workers threatened with termination for raising concerns. Documentation of near misses classified as procedural adjustments. But what caught his attention weren't the complaints. It was the official safety reports attached to them. Perfect scores, perfect compliance, perfect safety records. Month after month of flawless performance. Mark pulled up the company's performance dashboard on his computer. 12 facilities across the country, all showing the same pattern over the past year. Safety incidents down 80%, productivity up 93%, employee satisfaction surveys at record highs, quality control defects at historic lows, training compliance at 100%. The kind of numbers that made shareholders dance and board members sleep easy. "Bullshit," he muttered, pushing back from his desk. He'd spent every summer during college working the assembly lines, learning the business from the ground up. His father had insisted on it. "You can't lead what you don't understand," he'd say, "and you can't understand what you haven't experienced." Those summers had taught him an essential truth. Perfection in manufacturing wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Reynolds, the quarterly board meeting starts in 5 minutes. Mr. Chen asked me to remind you about the safety achievement presentation." Mark grabbed his tablet and suit jacket, but paused at the door, looking back at his father's portrait. The old man's eyes seemed to follow him, asking silent questions. "Never forget where you came from, son," he'd always say. "The shop floor built this company, not the boardroom." The board meeting room buzzed with anticipation. Executives in tailored suits traded congratulations before the presentation even began. PowerPoint slides filled with green arrows pointing upward flashed across the screen. Safety numbers drew applause. Productivity charts earned proud nods. Cost-saving initiatives got knowing smiles. Linda Morris, the operations manager for their largest facility, delivered her report with practiced confidence. "As you can see, our new efficiency protocols have dramatically improved both safety and productivity. We're proud to report 0 serious incidents for the 3rd quarter running." Richard Chen, the longest-serving board member and his father's oldest friend, beamed with pride. "John would be over the moon with these numbers," he said, clapping Mark on the shoulder after the meeting. "The company's never been stronger. You've done him proud, son." But Mark couldn't shake the weight of the anonymous complaints. That night, alone in his office, he made his decision. He would go undercover as John Miller, a new hire at their largest facility. No executive escorts, no prepared tours, no polished presentations. He needed to see the truth for himself. The transformation took a week of careful preparation. His designer suits went into storage, replaced by durable work clothes from Target. His luxury watch gave way to a basic digital timepiece. His wedding ring hung on a chain beneath his shirt. John Miller was single, less complicated that way. Even his usually neat stubble grew out into something less manicured. Looking in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Maybe that was the point. The HR department, told only that John Miller was a special corporate diversity initiative, processed his paperwork without question. A few strategic clicks in the system ensured his records wouldn't raise flags. Mark thought of his father's insistence on working summers in the factory. How different would things be if every executive had done the same? By Monday morning, he was just another new hire, waiting at the employee entrance in steel-toed boots that still squeaked with newness. The early morning air carried the scent of machine oil and industrial cleaner. Workers shuffled past him, shoulders hunched, faces set in masks of resignation. No one looked up at the massive Safety First banner hanging above the entrance. "First day, huh?" A woman in her 40s approached him in the parking lot, her safety vest worn but meticulously clean. Her name tag read, Sarah Chen. No relation to Richard, he wondered. Her eyes carried a weariness that her smile couldn't hide. "Don't worry, stick with me. Been here 15 years, seen it all, survived it all." Sarah's orientation wasn't anything like the polished corporate videos. She showed him the real rhythms of the floor. Which machines needed extra caution? That press has a delay in the safety stop, count 3 seconds after you hit it. Which supervisors actually cared about safety? Mike in Section C will listen if something's wrong, the others just want their numbers. And which corners everyone was expected to cut? They say inspect every piece, but they also say meet quota, figure out which one keeps you employed. Her lessons came with subtle warnings, delivered in quick whispers between tasks. "See that guy?" She nodded toward a young Hispanic man in a crisp new uniform, enthusiasm radiating from his every movement. "James Rodriguez, started last week. Still has that look, like he believes all the safety posters on the wall." Her tone carried equal parts fondness and concern. "Give him time. We all started like that." But it was Linda Morris who commanded the floor's attention. The same woman who had presented perfect numbers to the board now moved through the facility like a storm front, clipboard in hand, targets always on her lips. "Numbers, people. I need those numbers up. Corporate's watching." Her heels clicked against concrete, a sound that made workers flinch and pick up their pace. Mark noticed how she never looked at the actual work being done, only at her charts and metrics. At the end of his first week, Mark had heard enough to make his stomach turn. Linda's conversation with a supervisor, thinking no one was listening. "Just adjust the numbers like always. Corporate never checks the details anyway. And if anyone complains, remind them how many people want their jobs." The casual way she said it, like discussing the weather, that's what shook him most. But it was what he saw that truly chilled him. Workers rushing between machines, skipping safety checks to meet impossible quotas, maintenance logs signed without inspections, training sessions marked complete for employees who'd never attended. A young worker named Tommy operating a machine he clearly hadn't been trained on, his hands shaking as he tried to keep up. And everywhere, his father's motto mocked him, from faded posters: safety first, everything else second. Each night, he returned to his office after everyone had left. The security guard knew him only as Mr. Reynolds checking up on some late work. He'd sit there, reviewing his notes, his father's portrait watching over him. The gold letters beneath it no longer felt like a company motto. They felt like an accusation. 1 week in, and he already knew something was terribly wrong at Reynolds Manufacturing. Walking through the facility that Friday afternoon, he passed the employee break room and overheard a conversation that stopped him in his tracks. "Did you hear about Pete in assembly?" a hushed voice said. "Doctor told him he needed surgery from that injury last month, the one they made him report as just a strain." "Yeah," another voice replied. "Linda told him if he filed for workers' comp, they'd find someone else who could handle the job requirements. He's got 3 kids and a mortgage. What's he supposed to do?" Mark lingered by the water cooler, pretending to check his phone while listening. The voices continued, unaware of his presence. "Remember when Mr. Reynolds Sr. would visit? Man, those were different times. He caught Johnson running his machine without guards once, shut down the whole line until maintenance fixed it properly. Didn't care about the production numbers, said one injury wasn't worth a month of quotas." Yeah, well, those days are gone. Now it's all about the numbers. Safety first? More like safety when convenient. Mark thought about his father's last visit to this facility just 2 months before his heart attack. He'd noticed something was off that day. His father had been quieter than usual on the drive home, distracted. "Something's changed," he'd said finally. "I can't put my finger on it, but..." "Keep your eyes open, son. A company's culture can rot from the inside if you're not careful." Had his father suspected what was happening? Had the stress of knowing but not being able to prove anything contributed to his death? The thought hit Mark like a physical blow. Back in his office that night, he spread out his week's worth of notes across the desk. Patterns emerged. Systematic violations, coordinated cover-ups, a culture of fear wrapped in a veneer of corporate success. The real question wasn't what had happened to his father's company. The real question was, what was he going to do about it? And more importantly, how many lives hung in the balance while he figured out the answer? He picked up one of the anonymous complaints, reading it again. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. "Please, if anyone's actually reading these, we need help. We're scared every day, but we can't lose these jobs. Our families depend on us. Mr. Reynolds would never have let things get this bad." His father's portrait seemed to watch him as he made his decision. Tomorrow he would return as John Miller, would put on his work boots and his costume of anonymity. But he would do more than just observe now. He would start gathering concrete evidence, building relationships, finding allies who remembered what Reynolds Manufacturing used to stand for. The company motto caught the moonlight streaming through his office window. Safety first, everything else second. Words his father had lived by. Words that had built more than just a company. They had built a community, a family. Now those words stood as both an accusation and a challenge. Mark switched off his desk lamp, but remained sitting in the darkness. Somewhere in this building, Linda Morris was probably still at her desk too, fabricating tomorrow's perfect numbers, maintaining the illusion of flawless performance. How many other Linda Morrises were out there in the other 11 facilities? How deep did this corruption really go? He had a lot to learn, and time might not be on his side. But one thing was certain, his father's legacy deserved better than this. And so did every worker who walked through those factory doors, trusting that safety first was more than just words on a wall. Act 2, Complications and Investigation. 2 weeks into his undercover mission, Mark Reynolds, still playing the role of John Miller, was no longer just observing. He was living the reality of the workers he'd sworn to protect, feeling the weight of impossible expectations and silent desperation that permeated every corner of the Reynolds manufacturing facility. The factory floor had its own language, a complex system of signals and unspoken rules that Mark was slowly learning to decode. A quick tap on the shoulder meant a supervisor was coming. A crossed finger warned to work by the book, someone important was touring. 2 fingers, held low and subtle, meant speed over safety. The numbers were down and corners needed to be cut. Sarah Chen became his primary guide and unexpected ally. Her 15 years at the facility had transformed her into a walking encyclopedia of survival strategies. One morning, as they worked side by side on the assembly line, she pointed out the machine's safety guards, supposedly checked every shift, but now routinely disabled. "Watch this," she whispered, her experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency. "See these guards? They're supposed to be thoroughly inspected each shift. But look," she ran her fingers along the edge of a massive press machine, showing Mark how several safety mechanisms had been deliberately compromised. "Can't meet quota otherwise. Management knows. They just pretend they don't." Mark documented everything he could, using his phone like a secret diary. Each violation, each cut corner, each moment of systemic pressure became a digital record. But the real story wasn't in the technical violations. It was in the faces of his coworkers. The resigned looks when near misses were swept under the rug. The silent nods when someone mentioned "adjusted." James Rodriguez, the other new hire, still maintained his initial enthusiasm. During lunch breaks, he would share stories about why he'd taken this job. "My dad worked construction his whole life," he told Mark one day, his eyes bright with determination. "Always said the most dangerous thing on any job site wasn't the equipment, it was the pressure to cut corners." Mark watched James carefully. The young man represented everything the company used to stand for: hope, dedication, belief in the system. But Mark could already see the system wearing him down. day by day, shift by shift. Linda Morris remained the most fascinating and terrifying figure on the factory floor. Her management style was a masterclass in manipulation. She could walk through the facility, clipboard in hand, delivering impossible targets with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Workers would straighten up, work faster, push themselves to the absolute limit, all to avoid her disapproving gaze. One afternoon, Mark overheard a conversation that chilled him to the bone. Linda was discussing production numbers with a shift supervisor, her voice low but intense. "We're 3% below target," she said. "I don't care how you make up the difference, just get it done." The supervisor, a middle-aged man named Greg who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, nodded nervously. "But the safety logs." "Safety logs can be adjusted," Linda cut him off. "Corporate only cares about the final numbers. As long as everything looks good on paper, we're fine." Mark had to resist the urge to intervene, to reveal his true identity. Instead, he continued sorting materials, his hands steady despite the anger building inside him. Sarah became more than just a guide. She became a confidant. During quieter moments, she would share stories about the facility's transformation. "We used to be proud to work here," she told him one day, her voice tinged with a profound sadness. "Now we're just trying to survive until retirement, assuming we make it that long." Her stories painted a picture of gradual decline. Under John Reynolds Sr.'s leadership, the company had been different. Safety wasn't just a poster on the wall, it was a living, breathing commitment. Employees were family. Mistakes were learning opportunities, not grounds for punishment. But something had changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the culture had shifted. Productivity became the god, and safety the reluctant sacrifice. Mark's investigation revealed a complex web of manipulation. Performance metrics were constantly massaged. Incident reports were rewritten. Training sessions were marked as completed without ever actually happening. Workers were pressured into silence, their jobs and their families' livelihoods constantly held over their heads like a sword of Damocles. He discovered a pattern of systematic suppression. Employees who raised concerns found themselves marginalized. Their shifts changed, their opportunities for advancement mysteriously vanishing. The few who persisted were often pushed out entirely, replaced by more compliant workers. James, still holding on to his initial idealism, became an unexpected source of information. His openness, his willingness to ask questions that others avoided, often revealed more than he realized. During one lunch break, he shared a story about a near-miss incident that had been completely unreported. "I saw Tommy almost get his hand caught in the press last week," James confided. "But when I tried to fill out an incident report, the supervisor told me to keep quiet, said it would make the whole team look bad." Mark made careful notes, building a case that went far beyond simple safety violations. This was systemic corruption, a deliberate strategy of suppression and manipulation that put workers' lives at risk to maintain a facade of corporate perfection. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. Mark knew he needed a comprehensive understanding of how deep the problem went. He began cultivating relationships, earning trust, listening more than he spoke. Some workers were initially suspicious. A new hire asking too many questions was always viewed with caution. But Sarah's endorsement and Mark's genuine interest gradually broke down barriers. Workers began sharing stories, not just of safety violations, but of personal struggles, of the constant pressure they faced. One evening, working late to help Greg with some inventory, Mark discovered a hidden cache of falsified safety logs. Dates were changed, incidents were minimized or entirely erased. It was meticulous work, designed to create the illusion of perfect compliance. The deeper Mark dug, the more complex the problem became. This wasn't just about one facility or one manager. The rot seemed to extend deeper, potentially reaching into the corporate structure itself. By the end of his second week, Mark had compiled a dossier that would shock the board of directors. But he knew simply presenting evidence wouldn't be enough. He would need a strategy, a way to expose the truth without causing catastrophic damage to the company his father had built. As he sat in the small apartment he was renting during his undercover mission, surrounded by notes and digital recordings, Mark thought about his father. What would John Reynolds Sr. do in this situation? The answer came to him with crystal clarity. He would put the workers first, always. The investigation was far from over, and Mark was just beginning to understand the true scope of the challenge before him. The factory continued its relentless rhythm, machines humming, workers moving with a mixture of resignation and determination, and John Miller, Mark Reynolds, watched and waited, gathering the evidence that would eventually change everything. As the weeks progressed, Mark discovered an even more insidious layer of corporate manipulation. He learned about a sophisticated internal system that actively discouraged reporting of safety concerns. Employees who raised issues found themselves subtly punished through a complex network of informal sanctions. Performance reviews would mysteriously become more critical. Overtime opportunities would dry up. Promising team members would find themselves passed over for promotions, their potential careers quietly derailed by whispers and strategic marginalization. The economic pressure was perhaps the most powerful tool of control. In a region where manufacturing jobs were becoming increasingly scarce, Reynolds Manufacturing wielded an almost feudal power over its workforce. Many employees were local, their families having worked in the facility for generations. They understood that speaking up could mean not just losing their job, but potentially becoming unemployable in an already challenging job market. Mark saw families trapped in a system that valued corporate metrics over human lives, where the cost of silence seemed lower than the price of speaking truth. Mark's own emotional journey began to mirror those of the workers he was investigating. The initial anger he felt was slowly transforming into a complex mixture of rage, compassion, and strategic determination. He was no longer just a CEO conducting an investigation, he was becoming a conduit for the voiceless, a bridge between the corporate boardroom and the factory floor. Every falsified log, every suppressed incident report, every worker's hushed complaint became a personal mission. He understood now that this was about more than just his father's legacy. This was about fundamental human dignity, about creating a workplace where safety wasn't just a poster on the wall, but a lived commitment. Act 3. Crisis and Confrontation. On day 45 of Mark's undercover operation, everything changed. At 2:17 p.m. on what should have been a routine afternoon shift, the sound everyone dreaded finally came. A piercing screech of metal, followed by a sickening crunch and an instant of absolute silence that felt like an eternity. Tommy Rodriguez, the young worker Mark had noticed struggling during his first weeks, lay crumpled beside a press machine, his right arm bent at an impossible angle. The safety guard that should have prevented this had been deliberately disabled, just as Sarah had shown Mark weeks earlier. Crimson was spreading across the concrete floor, a stark contrast to the gray uniformity of the factory. Mark's training kicked in. His first instinct was to rush forward, to help, to do something. But years of careful investigation had taught him the importance of observation. He watched the scene unfold with a clinical detachment that felt both professional and deeply personal. The factory floor erupted into controlled chaos. Linda Morris appeared within seconds, her clipboard already in hand, her eyes darting not to Tommy but to the machinery, to the potential impact on production numbers. Her movements were precise, calculated, a choreography of damage control that had been practiced countless times before. "Everyone back to your stations," Linda's voice cut through the murmur of concerned workers. "Rodriguez, stay still, medical is on the way." Sarah was the first to Tommy's side, her decades of experience showing in her calm, precise movements. "Don't move him," she barked at the workers who rushed forward. "Call medical, and someone get the incident log, everything, exactly as it happened." Mark noticed the subtle signals passing between workers. A crossed finger here, a quick glance there. They were preparing their story, synchronizing their narrative before the official investigation began. It was a dance he had watched unfold multiple times during his undercover mission, the careful construction of a corporate truth that bore little resemblance to reality. Tommy was barely conscious, his face pale and slick with sweat. Mark could see the pain etching lines into the young man's forehead, could hear his ragged breathing. But more than the physical injury, he saw the fear, the absolute terror of knowing what this meant, a potentially career-ending injury in an economic landscape where jobs were scarce and mercy was rarer. The medical team arrived with practiced efficiency. Paramedics moved Tommy onto a gurney, stabilizing his arm, checking his vitals. Mark watched as Linda immediately began speaking with them, her voice low, her demeanor controlled. He knew exactly what was happening. The narrative was already being shaped. The incident was already being minimized. James Rodriguez, no relation to Tommy, but sharing the same last name and the same vulnerable position, approached Mark during the aftermath. His earlier enthusiasm had been replaced by a look of shell-shocked understanding. "This is why my dad warned me," he said quietly. "This is exactly what he was talking about." Mark placed a hand on James's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that felt both genuine and calculated. "Tell me more," he said softly. James's story spilled out. His father, a construction worker for 30 years, had always spoken about workplace safety, not as an abstract concept, but as a matter of life and death. He used to say that every safety rule was written in blood, James explained. Someone got hurt, so a rule was created to prevent it from happening again. But here, at Reynolds Manufacturing, those rules were nothing more than performative gestures, checkboxes to be ticked, metrics to be managed, rather than genuine protections for human life. Linda was pulling Tommy's supervisor aside, her voice low but intense. Mark, positioning himself close enough to hear, caught fragments of the conversation. "Adjust the log. Equipment malfunction, not a procedure issue. You understand?" The supervisor, Greg, Mark recognized, looked pale. "But Tommy will be taken care of," Linda cut him off. "Workers' comp, maybe a settlement, but nothing that touches our safety record." Mark's phone was recording everything. His hand was steady, his breath controlled. This was beyond personal now. This was about every worker who had been silenced, every near miss that had been buried, every life that had been reduced to a number on a spreadsheet. The facility's internal dynamics were laid bare in that moment. The medical team's arrival, the careful management of information, the rapid suppression of potential witnesses. It was a well-oiled machine of corporate damage control. Sarah caught Mark's eye across the room. No words were needed. They both knew this was a turning point. Later that evening, as the facility quieted and the official reports were being drafted, Mark accessed the company's internal systems. Years of working alongside his father had taught him every backdoor, every administrative shortcut. He began downloading everything, not just the safety logs, but communication records, email chains, performance metrics. The evidence was damning, not just at this facility, but across all 12 Reynolds Manufacturing locations. A systematic approach to hiding the truth, of valuing productivity over human life, reports that had been massaged, incidents that had been buried, training records that were complete fabrications. His father's motto, "Safety first, everything else second," now felt like a cruel joke. Mark thought about Tommy, about Sarah, who had survived 15 years in this system, about James, whose idealism was being crushed day by day, about all the workers who had been reduced to mere components in a machine that valued efficiency over humanity. He thought about his father, about the legacy that was being systematically dismantled, not by external forces, but by the very people entrusted to protect it. John Reynolds Sr. had built this company on principles of integrity, of genuine care for workers, and now it had become something unrecognizable. The next morning would change everything. Mark had a plan, not just to expose the violations, but to restore the true legacy of Reynolds Manufacturing, to make his father's vision a reality again. But first, he needed to ensure he had everything, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence that would prove this wasn't just an isolated incident, but a corporate way-by strategy of suppression and deceit. As dawn broke, Mark Reynolds, still in the guise of John Miller, began to prepare for the confrontation that would define not just his career, but the future of the company his family had built. The factory waited, quiet and unsuspecting. Another day of hidden truths, of silent compromises. But not for much longer. The machinery of change was already in motion, and nothing would stop it now. That night, Mark discovered something even more troubling buried deep in the company's digital archives. A series of confidential emails dating back 2 years revealed a coordinated effort to manipulate safety metrics across all Reynolds Manufacturing facilities. Richard Chen, the board member who had praised Mark's leadership just weeks ago, appeared to be a central figure in these communications. The emails showed a calculated approach to redefining safety standards, not to improve worker protection, but to make compliance easier to fabricate. The evidence painted a picture of systemic corruption that went far beyond Linda Morris or a single facility. It was a corporate strategy, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained. Performance bonuses were tied directly to safety metric achievements, creating a perverse incentive system where managers were rewarded for creating the appearance of safety rather than actual worker protection. Mark realized he was no longer just investigating a localized problem. He was uncovering a fundamental rot in the company's corporate culture. As he compiled the documentation, Mark began to understand the true complexity of his mission. This wasn't just about exposing violations or holding individuals accountable. It was about fundamentally reshaping a corporate culture that had lost its way. His father had built Reynolds Manufacturing on a simple but powerful premise that a company's true value was measured by the lives it protected, not the profits it generated. Somewhere along the way, that vision had been corrupted, replaced by a cold calculus of efficiency and economic performance. Act 4. Reckoning and Transformation. The night before the board meeting, Mark Reynolds barely slept. The weight of his father's legacy, the lives of hundreds of workers, the future of Reynolds Manufacturing, all of it pressed down on him with an intensity that made sleep impossible. His apartment was a war room of evidence. Digital files backed up in multiple locations, physical copies of documents secured in a fireproof safe, recordings carefully organized, transcripts meticulously prepared. Each piece of evidence was a weapon, carefully chosen, precisely aimed. Sarah Chen had been instrumental in his preparation. Over late-night meetings and clandestine phone calls, she had helped him understand the full depth of the systemic issues. Her 15 years of experience provided insights no corporate report could capture. She knew the names behind the numbers, the human stories behind each falsified log, each suppressed incident. "They'll fight you," she had warned him just 2 nights ago. "These people don't just protect a broken system, they've become the system." Mark thought about Tommy Rodriguez, about the young man whose shattered arm had become the catalyst for this entire investigation. He had visited Tommy several times during his recovery, listening to his story, understanding the true human cost of corporate negligence. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a crisp Tuesday morning. Mark arrived early, his evidence carefully organized, his strategy meticulously planned. He was no longer John Miller, the factory worker. He was Mark Reynolds, CEO of Reynolds Manufacturing, and he was ready to reclaim his father's legacy. Richard Chen arrived first, his usual confident stride slightly subdued. Mark watched him carefully, seeing the subtle signs of a man who knew something was coming but wasn't quite sure what. The other board members filtered in, some confident, some nervous, all unaware of the storm about to break. The conference room was a monument to corporate success. Mahogany tables, leather chairs, framed photographs of manufacturing facilities, portraits of past leadership, including John Reynolds Sr., watching from the walls. Mark felt his father's portrait was the only one truly seeing what was about to unfold. When he stood to speak, the room fell silent. Gone was the hesitant young executive they had known. In his place was a leader, forged in the crucible of the factory floor, tempered by weeks of first-hand experience. "Gentlemen," he began, "for the past 6 weeks I've been working undercover at our largest manufacturing facility, not as an executive, but as a line worker named John Miller." The room erupted in murmurs. Richard Chen's face went pale, a subtle flush creeping up his neck. Mark recognized the tell, the same look he'd seen on supervisors who knew their lies were about to be exposed. He proceeded methodically, presenting evidence with surgical precision. The falsified safety logs stretched back 3 years, a systematic approach to manufacturing corporate perfection. Each document was a cut, each recording a deeper wound to the company's carefully constructed facade. The board members tried to interrupt, to redirect, to minimize. Mark shut down each attempt with a calm, ironclad precision that would have made his father proud. Detailed reports showed how safety incidents had been deliberately misclassified, near misses reclassified as equipment malfunctions, serious injuries reduced to minor strains, an entire ecosystem of corporate deception, carefully constructed and meticulously maintained. Richard Chen attempted to mount a defense. These are isolated incidents, he argued, his voice losing its usual confidence. Mark played the recordings. Emails, testimonies from workers. The systematic nature of the cover-ups became undeniable. Tommy Rodriguez's injury became more than just an incident. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Mark shared Tommy's medical reports, his rehabilitation challenges, the life-altering consequences of a single moment of corporate negligence. But Mark wasn't there just to destroy, he was there to rebuild. He outlined a comprehensive transformation plan that went far beyond simple policy changes. A complete restructuring of safety protocols, a worker-led safety council with real power and independence, transparent reporting mechanisms, comprehensive worker protection programs. Sarah Chen would lead the new safety initiatives. Her decades of experience and unimpeachable integrity made her the perfect choice. James Rodriguez would be fast-tracked into a management training program, a living example of the company's commitment to its workers. Tommy would receive full medical support, comprehensive rehabilitation, and a leadership role in developing worker safety programs. His injury would become a catalyst for positive change, not just a statistic to be buried. The board meeting stretched for hours. Votes were called, alliances shifted. By the end, the old guard had been systematically dismantled. Linda Morris was terminated. Richard Chen was asked to resign from the board. But Mark knew the real work was just beginning. That afternoon, he returned to the factory floor, no longer undercover, but as himself. The workers watched him cautiously, uncertainty etched into their faces. Sarah was the first to approach him. "You kept your word," she said simply. Mark nodded. "My father always said, a company is only as good as the people who make it run. We lost sight of that, but we're going to find our way back." The transformation wasn't just structural, it was cultural, a fundamental reimagining of what a manufacturing company could be. Mark implemented a radical transparency program, monthly town halls where workers could speak freely, an independent review board with real power to investigate safety concerns, performance metrics that prioritized worker safety over productivity. Training programs were completely overhauled, not just mandatory sessions to check a box, but comprehensive educational initiatives that empowered workers with knowledge and agency. The industry watched carefully. What could have been a corporate disaster became a model of responsible transformation. Other manufacturing companies began to look at Reynolds Manufacturing not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of what was possible when a company truly committed to its workers. 1 year to the day after Tommy's injury, Mark stood in the facility where everything had changed. The machinery hummed, with safety guards in place, with regular inspections, with a culture of transparency and care. He thought about his father, about the legacy that had been nearly destroyed and was now being rebuilt. Safety first, everything else second, was no longer just a motto printed on a wall. It was a living, breathing commitment. Sarah Chen approached him, a report in her hand. "Incident rates down 60%, she said. Productivity up 22%, and not a single falsified log." Mark smiled. This was his father's real legacy, not the empire of factories, but the commitment to the people who made those factories run. The transformation was complete, but Mark knew the work was never truly finished. A company, like a living organism, required constant care, constant attention, constant recommitment to its fundamental values. As the factory floor moved around him, workers safe, respected, valued, Mark Reynolds understood that he had done more than save a company. He had restored a promise, not just to his father's memory, but to every worker who had ever been reduced to a number, every life that had been considered expendable in the pursuit of corporate success. The machinery of Reynolds Manufacturing continued to hum, but now it sang a different song, one of hope, of dignity, of true human potential. Months after the transformation, Mark discovered something unexpected. The changes they had implemented were creating a ripple effect far beyond the walls of Reynolds Manufacturing. Other companies in the industry began reaching out, requesting consultations, seeking to understand how a complete cultural overhaul could actually improve both worker safety and corporate performance. Tommy Rodriguez played a pivotal role in this new narrative. Rather than becoming a victim of the system, he became its most powerful advocate. His personal story, from a young worker nearly crushed by corporate negligence to a key figure in workplace safety reform, became a powerful testament to the potential for genuine corporate transformation. He developed a comprehensive training program that was now being adopted by manufacturing facilities across the country, transforming his personal tragedy into a catalyst for widespread change. The financial markets, initially skeptical of the radical changes, began to take notice. Contrary to traditional corporate wisdom that suggested worker protection would harm productivity, Reynolds Manufacturing saw its stock price climb. Investors realized that a truly engaged workforce, one that felt valued and protected, was actually more productive, more innovative, and more committed to the company's success. What had seemed like a risky proposition was proving to be a brilliant strategic move. Mark's approach attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Business schools began studying the Reynolds Manufacturing transformation as a case study in ethical leadership. Doctoral students wrote dissertations about the cultural shift. The company became a beacon of hope in an industrial landscape often characterized by worker exploitation. But for Mark, it was about honoring his father's true legacy, the belief that a company's most valuable asset was its people. As the years passed, the story of Reynolds Manufacturing became more than just a corporate turnaround. It became a movement. Other industries began to look at workplace safety and worker protection not as a cost to be minimized, but as a fundamental corporate responsibility. Mark Reynolds had done more than transform a single company. He had begun to reshape the very concept of corporate leadership, proving that profitability and human dignity were not mutually exclusive, but intrinsically linked.